The shovel hit something hard. Harry Reginald Hall stopped. It was 1919, southern Iraq, and the heat that afternoon made the air shimmer above the sand. al-Ubaid, a small mound, barely half a kilometre across, rising just 2 meters above the flat ground. Nothing special, they thought, just another forgotten hill in a landscape full of forgotten hills. But when the earth gave way and the first figurine emerged, Hall felt something strange. Not the weight of the piece, the shape. And jackal faces, but those were masks, symbolic representations. You could tell they were masks. Carefully took notes, sketched them, but he didn't have an explanation. Nobody did. Created art, and for some reason they had chosen to depict themselves, or their gods, or something, as reptilian beings. Before the Sumerians ever built their first ziggurat, the Iranian highlands, as far south as the Persian Gulf. Figurines and pottery. He found evidence of sophisticated society, clay tokens, early accounting systems, precursors to writing, irrigation canals that brought water from the Tigris and Euphrates to fields that shouldn't have been able to support agriculture. Spot over and over for hundreds of years. Each new temple constructed directly on top of the old one, creating layers of sacred architecture that stretched back into deep time. Millennia. Dirt. They were sophisticated, organized. They had trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. They had specialized craftsmen, potters, metalworkers, builders. They had priests and temples and religious rituals that we can only guess at. Coming, more than 100 of them eventually, found at Eridu and other sites across the region. All with the same distinctive features, the elongated heads, the slit eyes, the reptilian appearance. People who transformed themselves symbolically to communicate with the spirit world. Maybe they're ritual objects, maybe they're toys, maybe they're portraits. Sumerians came later. Around 4000 BC, a new culture began to emerge in southern Mesopotamia. They built bigger cities, invented writing, created the first great civilization we have records of, and they built their cities right on top of the old settlements. On top of Eridu on top of Eridu. They used the same sites, worshipped in the same temples, farmed the same fields. Those mentions are so obscure, so buried in myth and legend, that we can't separate fact from fiction anymore. There's something waiting, something that existed 7,000 years ago, something that built cities, tamed rivers, invented agriculture, and created societies. Something that, for reasons we still don't understand, chose to represent itself with the face of a lizard. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers down near the Persian Gulf was harsh, flat, hot. Dusty most of the year, flooded the rest. Marshlands stretched for miles, brackish water mixing with river sediment, creating a landscape that seemed designed to keep humans out. Instead of where it naturally flowed, you could turn desert into farmland, marshes into villages, chaos into civilization. People first settled there around 5400 BC. It was just a small shrine. A single rectangular room, about 6 by 10 feet, mud brick walls, an altar, a niche carved into the wall for a statue of a god. Nothing fancy. Of the old one, level 17, level 16, level 15. Down and down through time, each temple slightly larger, slightly more elaborate than the one before. Second, 18 times they said, this spot, this precise location is sacred. And they kept coming back to it for millennia. Wedding cakes stretching back into prehistory that declared, we belong here. Individual families scratching out a living. That's organized, planned, coordinated labor on a massive scale. Someone had to design those canals, figure out the angles, the flow rates, where to dig, how deep. Someone had to organize the workforce, assign tasks, make sure everyone contributed. Early as 5000 BC, they hunted gazelle and deer, fished the marshes, gathered reeds for construction. Really interesting, because surplus creates something else, hierarchy. More elaborate, central locations, tripartite floor plans with a large central reception area flanked by smaller rooms on each side. Elite residences, probably, or administrative centers, places where decisions got made, somewhere, wanted, and they brought their knowledge with them, their pottery techniques, their irrigation methods, their agricultural practices. Shows up in Syria, Turkey, Iran, the Arabian coast, hundreds of miles in every direction, some sites showing pure Ubaid culture, others showing a mix, local traditions blending with Ubaid influences. Culture spread across such a vast region. Subscribe, because there are so many more stories buried in the sand, waiting to be told. Suddenly, but gradually, over centuries, their culture transformed into something else. The Uruk period, the rise of the Sumerians, the first true cities with walls and kings and cuneiform writing, became so distorted by time and myth that we can't separate truth from legend anymore. Reptilian faces and their unanswered questions. Expect from people living in mud brick houses in the middle of marshland 7,000 years ago. Firing. Horizontal bands circling the rim, vertical lines dividing the space into sections, zigzags, cross-hatching, concentric circles, sometimes abstract, sometimes suggesting stylized animals or plants, though simplified so much you have to squint to see it. Random splashes of paint, but carefully measured designs that required steady hands and clear vision. Different sites, hundreds of miles apart, you see the same motifs, the same placement, the same aesthetic sense. Someone was teaching this, passing down knowledge, maintaining standards across generations and vast distances, to create the most perfect vessels, the most intricate designs. Mesopotamian history. In later Sumerian mythology, snakes represented both creation and chaos, wisdom and danger, the primordial waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, sources of life but also capable of devastating floods. Authority. These aren't ordinary people, they're special, sacred, in the process of becoming something else, something more. Transformation. Unless the entire family line was considered sacred, descendants of the divine, bloodlines that carried something otherworldly in their veins. Appears in ancient Peru, in Central America, in parts of Africa and Asia. Why not Mesopotamia? Forward in ways human faces don't. Even with cranial deformation, you don't get that, not naturally. Sure, because around 4000 BC something changed. Become the largest urban center in the world at that time. Uruk, where writing was invented, where the first true cities with walls and kings and complex bureaucracies emerged, where the Sumerians created the first civilization we have written records of. Grew from what came before. They inherited the irrigation systems, the temples, the settlements, the agricultural techniques that migrated into the region, mixing with the Ubaid population, adopting their technology while bringing their own language and cultural innovations, a fusion of peoples creating something greater than either alone. Shifting burial practices. Credit. They wrote the epics, the king lists, the law codes. Their names are in the history books. Gilgamesh, Ur-Nammu, Hammurabi. We remember them. Known only by the archaeological site where we first found their pottery. Deposited when water sits on top of land for a long time. Archaeological proof of the Old Testament. Sometimes it wiped out entire settlements. That's what happens when you build your civilization in a floodplain. BC, your family has farmed this land for generations. The irrigation canals your grandfather helped dig feed barley fields that stretch to the horizon. The temple where you worship sits on foundations laid by your ancestors centuries ago. Everything. What's strange? The flood at Ur happened right in the middle of the Ubaid period. It didn't end the culture. They rebuilt, kept going, maintained their pottery styles, their architecture, their way of life for another 1,000 years after that flood. From al-Ubaid, massive thing, almost 9 feet wide, shows a lion-headed eagle with spread wings, talons gripping 2 deer. It's magnificent, detailed. The kind of metalwork that requires serious skill. dedicated to the goddess Ninhursag, built by Sumerian kings long after the Ubaid people were gone. Land, worshipped at the same sacred sites. To them, it was all one continuous story. Those first temples, who dug those first canals, who settled that land when it was nothing but hostile marsh, that knowledge got lost. Those stories, the Sumerians had them, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, stories about the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity before the Great Flood. Sages who were described as part human, part fish, creatures from the water who taught forbidden knowledge. The original settlers who came to the marshes, who mastered water management, who built the first temples and taught the first agricultural techniques. Human. Ubaid isn't what they called themselves. It's just the archaeological site where we first found their stuff. Their real name is lost. Their language is unknown. Their myths and stories and songs and prayers gone, erased, as if they never existed. The Sumerians built on top of, without ever knowing whose sacred spaces they were usurping. Deeply unsettling about the Ubaid, not because of those strange figurines, though they haunt you once you've seen them. Not because of the mystery surrounding their origins or their disappearance, but because of what they represent. About it, the Ubaid lasted 2,000 years, 2,000 years. That's longer than Christianity has existed, longer than Islam, longer than most of the empires and kingdoms we study in history class. The Roman Empire, at its peak, lasted maybe 500 years, depending on how you count. The British Empire, a few centuries. The United States is barely 250 years old. 80 generations of people living, dying, building, creating, worshipping, laughing, crying, loving, hating. Entire lifetimes stacked on top of each other, each person with their own dreams and fears and stories. Distinctive geometric pattern that would define Ubaid ceramics for centuries. Not the priest who stood in that tiny temple at Eridu 5,000 years ago and prayed to gods whose names are lost. Not the mother who held that child with the elongated head and wondered if her baby looked like the divine beings in the stories the elders told. They were sophisticated. They solved problems that would challenge modern engineers. They created art that still looks beautiful 7,000 years later. They built societies complex enough to coordinate labor for massive construction projects, maintain trade networks across hundreds of miles, develop specialized crafts, establish religious traditions that endured for millennia. Without the writing, without the accumulated knowledge of centuries, but fundamentally the same, people trying to survive, trying to build something that would last, trying to leave their mark on a world that seems determined to forget. Spaces they were occupying, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Islamic empires, the Ottomans, layer after layer of civilization, each one completely unaware that there had been something before, something foundational, something without which none of them would have existed. And even then, for decades, they were just a curiosity, an archaeological footnote. It's only in the last 50 years or so that scholars have started to understand how important they were, how much of what we think of as Sumerian civilization was actually built on Ubaid innovations. Hierarchies. All of it, Ubaid. The Sumerians just took it further, added writing, created kings and empires and myths that got written down. Right now that we think will last forever, but will be completely forgotten in a few thousand years? What names do we consider immortal, that will mean nothing to people in 7026 AD? What monuments do we think are permanent, that will be buried under sand and rubble? Puzzling future archaeologists who won't be able to read our languages or understand our symbols. Smartphones and have no idea what they were for, the way we find those clay tokens and can only guess they were for accounting. Will they create theories about our religious beliefs based on fragments of our art, getting it completely wrong, Because they don't have the context, the same way we argue about whether those figurines are gods or shamans or portraits. 1,000 years seemed permanent to the Ubaid, and yet here we are, 7,000 years later, not even knowing what they called themselves. History. Out how to survive where survival seemed impossible. People who built something beautiful and lasting and foundational. Anymore, not now, because people like you and me are talking about them, thinking about them, trying to understand who they were and what they accomplished, giving them back, in some small way, the recognition they deserved all along. Does it say about us that an entire civilization can exist for 2 millennia and then vanish so completely from memory? Civilizations out there, so many more stories buried in the sand, waiting for someone to remember them, waiting for someone to tell their story before time erases them completely. Continents. 1,000 years, the bones of the Ubaid people rest, nameless, forgotten by everyone who came after them.